Good evening. Welcome everybody to our second session in our series, Why Marx? Tonight we want to tackle the question, what actually is socialism? Sounds like an easy question if you're on the left, etc. There are lots of people who call themselves socialists. But I think during the Corbyn years, we have seen very vividly how much this concept has been misunderstood and often conflated with social democracy or Keynesianism to one degree or another. For example, despite many people hoping and arguing for it, all of us here would probably agree that Jeremy Corbyn most definitely would not have been able to deliver socialism if he'd become prime minister, even if he wanted. And even if the whole parliamentary Labour Party and the entire establishment had not been busy totally undermining and sabotaging and attacking him. Socialism, in our view, cannot be delivered through parliament. It certainly cannot be established in one country. Parliament is an important platform and socialists should make use of it if we can, but socialism requires the active participation of the vast majority of the working class. It's not an act of parliament and not a minority coup either. That's also what the Soviet Union was about. It was not what was not socialism in our view. So there are slight differences amongst our speakers on this issue. When planning for this session, it kind of transpired that Nick and John believe one thing, that socialism and communism are interchangeable, at least in the writings of Marx. And Luke, I believe, and I think I'm more with him on this, will argue that socialism is the transition from capitalism to communism. We want to find out what these differences actually entail, and if they're more about anything than semantics and just different words or a whole different understanding and approach to political struggle. We believe that these differences should be argued out in the open and not brushed under the carpet as so many groups on the left do. And having had a good debate on potential differences, we can actually start to move forward together with clarity and purpose. So what is socialism? Is it the same as communism? Is it like social democracy? Is it what the Soviet Union had? Is it, well, was there communism in the Soviet Union, socialism, one or the other, both? So these are some kind of questions we want to look at tonight. A bit of housekeeping quickly. This meeting is being live streamed on various platforms and we're recording it and we'll put it out as a video. So if you don't want to be recorded, if you don't want to be heard or seen, don't put your hand up, don't come in. You can leave a question in the Q&A and I can read it out. Otherwise, please put your hand up under reactions. There's a little hand. Click that button if you want to speak. We try to take as many comrades as possible and we want to have a good discussion, but we might not be able to take everybody if lots of people have their hands up. I hope that's okay with comrades, and apologies in advance. So without further ado, our first speaker is Nick Rack. And you need to unmute yourself, comrade. It's his first Zoom meeting.
Yeah, my first Zoom meeting ever. Oh, first of all, thank you, Comrade Tina, and thank you everybody for attending. I hope we've got a lot of repeat visitors from last week, and that people enjoyed last week. From my own point of view, I really enjoyed listening to the contributions and comments from people in the discussion, and I hope the same thing happens again today. In trying to prepare for this meeting, I'm reminded about how vast the writings of Marx and Engels are. And obviously there are very many other commentators that are worth reading as well. And so trying to distill all of that into a short 10, possibly 12 or even 15-minute contribution is almost impossible. We did have a couple of emails in from last week saying that they didn't learn anything from the session, so I hope this one's a bit different. But my advice or my approach to these sessions is that together we're trying to go back to Marx, or I would suggest go back to Marx and Engels. I don't divide the two. I think they were a team and they should be seen as a team with very similar, if not indistinguishable ideas. But to go back to them, a lot of us have developed our Marxism in particular groups where the ideas have been interpreted by leaders and so on. Quite often, when you actually read the originals, you wonder what it was that you were being taught. Of course, the writings of Marx and Engels aren't tablets of stone. They're not delivered from God. They are there to be challenged, interpreted, but most importantly, to analyze and applied, if appropriate, to new circumstances. There's a lot that's happened since Marx and Engels wrote, not least of which is the experience of the Soviet Union and the collapse of what was called communism in the Soviet Union. And obviously, we have to approach how we disseminate or put our ideas across in a way that takes into account the experiences of the working class. And I'm thinking particularly something that's going to come up in this discussion. I'll raise it now, the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, there are many in the Marxist left who I think make a complete fetish of this idea. They turn it into something which makes communists and Marxists look like wide-eyed lunatics who want to wield the guillotine against anybody who doesn't agree with them. And so it's important when studying Marx and Engels, we try to apply them in the context of the experience of the working class. Most sections of the working class, in my opinion, will look at the experience of the Soviet Union as being a dictator, or a dictatorship, I should say. And therefore, we have to explain what Marx meant. I think it's actually very easy to explain what Marx meant and to understand. And that is, he meant, and Engels meant, essentially, the period of the transition from capitalism to communism, in which the working class has come to power and taken state power and is using that state power as a lever, as a means to carry through the tasks that the working class has come to power to achieve. And that is essentially abolishing the exploitation of the working class. And I'll raise a few other ideas in a few minutes. But that idea of working class rule, of seizing control of the state, the question of violence obviously is raised. It seems to me that some on the Marxist left are enthralled by the idea of violence. But the state, as Marx explained, was an instrument of class rule. And under slave-owning societies, under feudalism, under capitalism, the state was the instrument of the minority ruling class. Whereas when the working class comes to power, it is, of course, the majority of people in society across the whole world. And therefore, the need of repression, the suppression of those who want to return to capitalism and so on, in my opinion, would be a lot less. And the idea that Marx and Engels both put forward was that over a period of time, the state would wither away, that what you would have is less of the government of people and more the administration of things and the conduct of the production of the requirements of society. Now, that's how I see the transition. That's the task of the working class, to come to power and to carry through the tasks that lay the basis for a new mode of production. So what did Marx mean by that? He meant the way that the technology, factories, land, rivers, seas, transport, machines and everything, how they were used under capitalism as a different mode of production from feudalism. In turn, that was a different mode of production from slaveholding societies. And from their analysis of the real world, Marx and Engels held the view, or formed the view, that the real next step, the necessary next step, was that those who constituted the working class, the proletariat, they were driven by their own exploitation to challenge their conditions of life, to challenge that exploitation. And so they saw that by challenging that exploitation, it meant ending the private ownership of those means of production. So you have the capitalist class, and even when Marx and Engels wrote, particularly Engels later, described the way in which even under capitalism there was a tendency to socialize the means of production, that you had the move to joint stock companies, big capitalist corporations, what we have now, multinational corporations, where the owners actually don't do anything. They franchise out the running of that to very well-paid employees in the terms of CEOs and so on. But the owners of capital, some of the managers might also be owners, but the main owners of capital sit there living a life of luxury, clipping coupons, basically, checking in the interest on their shares and so on. Whereas the workers are forced to struggle for the product that they create. They're creating surplus value for the owners, from which the owners take a profit. And the conditions of the working class drive them, compel them to challenge that state of affairs. So the next stage in the development of society from the point of Marx and Engels was rooted not in the ideas or the mind of great thinkers, but in the reality, the real world, and would be achieved not by an appeal to reason, but by implementing or carrying through that class struggle to its logical conclusion. Wow, that's 10 minutes already. So for Marx and Engels, socialism or communism was a new mode of production in which, in that transitional period, the working class would have moved through its control of the state. First of all, they would have completely smashed or destroyed the capitalist state. That was one of the lessons that Marx learned from the Paris Commune, that they couldn't just take hold of the ready-made state machine, precisely because previously it was a minority state, and now they were laying the basis for the state, a semi-state, or the withering away of the state. And so what may be called the dictatorship of the proletariat, in fact, was the most democratic, or would be the most democratic state that's ever existed. And that's because the working class would implement various steps. And Marx used the Paris Commune of 1871 as a model or as an example to show what the working class would, should, and could do. The election of all officials, the right of recall for people in office, electability through universal suffrage, no official to be paid more than the wage of a worker. So that meant that people like judges and others will all be elected. The removal of the national army and its replacement by a people's army, an armed people, getting rid of the state, of the police, particularly the political role of the state. And so smashing the repressive state machine, whilst at the same time, it would have to implement the economic steps, the abolition of private property, the ending of the wages system, so that side by side, the conditions of the economy and the conditions of the state change so that what emerges at the other side is communism. Now, the questions that Tina's asked in the chat that invited you all here, what is socialism? In my opinion, in the writings of Marx and Engels, is the same as communism. I don't see any basis for trying to prize a difference between socialism and communism. And so what did Marx and Engels mean by socialism? That's what I think that they meant, a new mode of production based on a classless, stateless society, production for need, the end of the wages system. The dictatorship of the proletariat, therefore, in my opinion, is actually the most democratic transitional phase that one could imagine. I think the phrase itself is an unhelpful anachronism, and we can find better ways of dealing with it. Now, I'll say now, I don't agree, therefore, with Luke's position that socialism is the period of the transition. I don't see any basis for finding that in the writings of Marx and Engels. But it may be that it simply is, as Tina said, a question of semantics. Does it really matter what we call that transitional period? If you read State and Revolution by Lenin, obviously somebody that knew Marx inside out, in my opinion, I think he misstates or misrepresents what Marx says in the Critique of the Gotha program. Marx talks about emerging from the previous transitional period into communism, and he talks about a first phase and then a higher phase. And Lenin refers to that first phase, and he says commonly referred to as socialism. So Lenin's using the word socialism actually to describe something else again, not Luke's position, not my position. So these things are important for us to discuss out. But the most important thing is, I think that amongst the three speakers, we actually share the same approach, that the working class must come to power, it must act in its own interests to smash the old state, to abolish the capitalist mode of production, and our aim is to achieve a classless, stateless society on the other side that will be the beginning, the real beginning for humanity.
Thank you very much, Nick. I should have mentioned Nick's writing on a blog called talkingaboutsocialism.org. You can see it now on screen. It's also, I think, quite helpful to remember that there are authors like Hal Draper who've made an effort to try and work out what this mysterious dictatorship of the proletariat means. And he's written books about it, one specific book where he claims, that's the one, that it means nothing more than rule. He used it in the term of the old Greek meaning, I think it's Greek, to a rule of the proletariat, not any particular gruesome methods necessarily. Doesn't mean that might not have to happen, that we might have to oppress the ruling class if it doesn't want to go ahead with socialism and come along with us. But it did not necessarily imply any particular brutal methods that always have to happen. Our next speaker is John Holliday from the Socialist Theory Study Group, and he's got a PowerPoint up, as you can see. Very nice. Hi.
Yes, thanks very much. I'm not sure I'll be able to stick entirely to this PowerPoint. Very new to this this game. I'll try and stick to the time limits as well. But basically, as was said, I do agree with Nick's analysis of Marx's writings, basically. But I don't find the evidence for a separate stage of socialism, communism in Marx's writings. I think he used the terms interchangeably, depending on who he was talking to. He described himself sometimes as a communist, sometimes as a socialist. What he was aiming for, sometimes as socialism, sometimes as communism. I don't think the distinctions were made. I would like to put up on the screen, because very often the distinction seems to arise from that critique of the Gotha program. Now, I've got that on the screen there. There's sections that are things, and I think they agree. First of all, let me just say, I think I agree with Nick, that we're somehow bamboozled by the language. If Marx hadn't studied Roman law, we wouldn't have to be having these discussions about what the dictatorship of the proletariat had meant, because I agree with Nick, what he meant was the most democratic form of society, not as dictatorship has come to mean rule over people, a repressive system. Dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning in Marx's terms, a period of society which was trying to guarantee as much democracy as possible without it being overcome by the ruling class, without the oppression that the ruling class would try to undermine the revolution. So quite apart from it being an anti-democratic measure, it was a pro-democratic measure. It was an attempt to guarantee democracy. We've also somewhat taken over by the proletariat as again, a term that I think he takes from the Roman Republic, which basically, why don't we just talk about the working class? Because I think that's what he means. But just to look at that section from the Gotha program, if you read the first part, it says, between capitalist and communist society lies period of revolutionary transformation of one into the other, a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. It doesn't describe socialism. It doesn't say that. It says it's the working class attempting to achieve its revolution, to get rid of the remnants of capitalist society and achieve a communist society. And in the paragraph beneath that, he refers to the first phase of communist society. It doesn't refer to socialism. And later on, describes a higher phase of communist society, which is largely what Nick was describing, I think, at the end of his talk. Now, it could be, and I agree that, you can interpret Marx in all sorts of different ways. We're stuck with different translations, different interpretations, different selections. I don't find evidence for Marx describing a separate socialist stage and a later communist stage. Now, it could be just nitpicking, and it could be just a linguistic thing. The unfortunate thing is so much of our history, it's the way it is used and its relationship to what happened in the Soviet Union and subsequent societies. With this definition of socialism as a distinct stage, we're able to go on to say, we are not talking about communism. We are talking about a different stage, socialism. And we can't abolish the capitalist mode of production entirely in that stage. We're stuck with it, and we're stuck with it in terms of the world system as well. So it's the way that phrase, socialism, has been used as a distinct stage to justify that argument about socialism in one country. So not just nitpicking, it becomes quite politically important. And in a lot of the writings, the Soviet Union, Stalin, and etc., they don't deal with the social relations of production. They just describe that separate stage as socialism. We don't have to talk about, we've established socialism. We don't need to talk about what underlies it, which is quite significant. Marx says somewhere, you never listen to what a ruling class says about itself, because they will always justify what they have. What you have to do is look beneath to the social relations of production. So that would be my first point on that. But I say we can disagree on that. I think then, you have to look at Marx's writings in the whole, and it then goes on to what Nick has described as communism, and which is, I understand it. If you look right back to Marx's early writings, here the distinction is very, very clear. It might be described in somewhat idealistic terms, in philosophical terms, but it's quite clear he wants to get rid of private property, supersession of private property, and a whole different form of society. He describes, if you look at Hegel's writings, then Hegel talks about alienation. Marx is contesting Hegel's notion of alienation and situating it in a particular form of society. So Marx himself is concerned with alienation, that lack of totality, that feeling inhuman in a human world. And he goes on from that position to describe communism rooted in the nature of what was developing in those early days when he was writing, a system of capital, a system of wage labor, money expanding throughout the world, productive system and entirely expanding. So having said that, so his descriptions there sound very philosophical, but they carry on throughout his writings. He wants a total change in the nature of society. Having said that, he then tries to locate that vision of socialism within a real situation. So communism is not for us a state of affairs which is to be established. It's a real movement. It is what's going on the ground under our feet. So I think when you're talking about real movement, Marx isn't just talking about development of productive forces. He is talking about that, but he's talking about, combined with that, there is development of a working class, a class that is developing. So there are two sides to that, both of them, which are a real movement, which is laying the basis for a different form of society. If I can move on from that slide to the next slide. In his writings, in those early writings, he also develops that idea of a revolutionary class, a working class. But it should be noted, he isn't worshipping the working class. He isn't, some sort of religious, these are the saviors of society. He sees that as a vehicle for a total revolution, because the working class has no property to impose. It has to get rid of all the existing forms of property. So it's a revolutionary class in that sense. It has to achieve its own liberation, but it cannot achieve its liberation without achieving the liberation of the whole human race. If I could go on to, but that again is from his early writings, but that seems to me, he's identified the working class in that fashion. Now, the working class, in my view, the way he describes it, it doesn't just exist in itself. It has to be created. It develops into a class capable of changing society, capable of ruling society. I go back to, again, an early writing, but his thesis on Feuerbach, because his critique of Hegel and of Feuerbach. And he describes changing of circumstances, because many people on the left would say what you've got to do is change the conditions of society, then you would have a different consciousness, a different relationship of people to it. But Marx is saying you can't do that. Things have to be changed from the bottom. The working class has to change itself in order to change society. It has to develop a class, it has to develop a consciousness that will enable it to change society. It can only do that through struggle. He defines it in these early writings as self-activity, self-changing. So it is that notion. People say, well, human nature, you can't say it. Marx is saying you have to have an idea of changing it, and you have to develop that idea, and you have to create the basis of that in class struggle. We go on to the next slide. I think this is just to reinforce that notion that Nick was talking about democracy and dictatorship. When Marx is talking about communism, he sees it as a mass movement, a movement of the immense majority in the interests of the immense majority. In order for that to take place, you have to have as full a democracy as possible. Nobody is going to do it for the working class. The working class have got to work out for themselves how they are going to change society in the process of struggle and try to achieve that society. Bit of a misprint there about pirate property, which should be private property. Anyway, let's go on to the next. And I'm sorry if I'm rushing this a bit. We are restricted by time. Basically, this is just about how everything has to change. And Marx, I think, maintains those ideas. It's not just the material basis of production that has to change under consciousness, under communism. There has to be a whole change in human beings, in human nature. This idea that we're selfish, individualistic, etc., has to undergo a change. He talks about that, about this notion of having and the way the ruling class impose a view of human nature on society, that human natures are by definition greedy and selfish, etc. All that has to be overcome, and it can only be overcome in struggle, with people trying to cooperate with each other to change society, what they have to do. It can't be left to anybody else to do it for them, it has to be worked out in struggle. Now, Marx, from those early writings, went on to develop political organizations. He contacted socialists, he was in touch with Engels, and they developed political ideas. So socialism, the struggle for socialism, communism became a political movement, albeit limited because of the nature of the society at that time. But he began to develop an organizational form, which is clearly revealed in the Communist Manifesto, an outcome of the Communist League. So all the ideas that I've described with trying to be put into a practical form as part of a political struggle, as a development of class consciousness and the proletariat trying to achieve its aims. Now, I don't want to be negative about this, but largely failed in that respect after the struggles of the 1840s. And now Marx, not entirely, but went back to the study. So large parts of his activity, and it has to be called activity, it's not sort of idealism, it's not about analyzing the nature of the system with which he was dealing, how capital has expanded throughout Europe in the main, but potentially throughout the world. So looking about those developments in the capitalist system and the ideas which supported them, a critique of political economy. So it's not just a critique of the system of production, but the ideas that support that system and try to make sense of it. Marx is trying to take that system apart from a different perspective, from a working class perspective, and he does that largely in the works of Capital that he develops. Having said that, I've just encourage everybody to read them. But my experience is a lot of people don't read Marx. They read the Communist Manifesto, they read the political struggles, but they don't read what they consider the dry economic works. But really, that's the whole basis that Marx was analysing the capitalist system upon. Lots of it is in note form, so you can't say it's a finished work. He's got everything right. He doesn't. It changes his mind, and other people put things together that perhaps he didn't say, but they develop. His ideas are developing in that same. In the course of that, working on analysing capital and the critique of ideas that support it, it isn't a static system. People largely say Marx doesn't discuss socialism, but he does implicitly. He looks at previous forms of society. His key characteristics in political economy, the distinction between use value and exchange value, that becomes very important. Most previous societies, money exists, commodity production, but not to the extent that it does. Most societies produce for use rather than exchange. So he looks back and he sees communism as a society that produces for use, for human need. Different social relationships. Some societies are dictatorial, even producing for use. He takes that, but he's looking back at previous societies in order to criticize the society in which he exists. So he looks back to primitive communism, peasant-based societies, all sorts of different societies occur in capitalism. Having said that, he also looks backwards, but he also looks forward. So he does talk about socialism in Capital. He describes it, again, this description of communism and socialism, I think he describes it as the associated producers, which is another phrase that comes up time and time again. But what he means is common ownership with control by the population. So he's talking there about future society. He's trying to criticize existing society in terms of the potentialities it creates for a different form of society. I'm skipping through. I know you're not going to read all these things, but what strikes me about a lot of discussion on the left and in Marxist organizations, Marx is implicitly analyzing the social relations of capital, a mode of production, and the categories that are involved in that mode of production, which are commodities, wages, capital, money, and the state. All those things become conditions of his analysis. So these notions are throughout Marx's writings, but they don't seem to be mentioned in a lot of Marxist discussion. He talks about abolishing wage labor, getting rid of wage labor, getting rid of money. Talks in the Communist Society, in the Communist Manifesto about disappearing, buying and selling. The communist abolition of buying and selling, that's in the Communist Manifesto. Yet how often do you hear in Marxist discussion groups or in leaflets that are given out, how often do you hear any discussion about abolishing the wages system, abolishing wage labor, getting rid of money, describing communism as a society of common ownership, production for use, abolition of money, abolition of the nation state, which are all basic ideas within Marx's writings. That's my concern overall. I've got a lot of quotes here about there's the nation state. You read all through particularly in the German ideology, again, very early writings, he talks about, the nation state being an ambiguous category that has been got rid of by capital. That production is worldwide, and the nation state is an anomaly. So the nation state has to be abolished. All those quotes basically say that. At some of his writings, he actually talks about the whole world changing all at once, can only be achieved all at once internationally. I'm sure I'm getting to the end of my time, but what I want to go on to is, the higher phase of communist society, and it remains throughout Marx's writings, and it is about unleashing human potentiality, human creativity. So it's not just about our basic needs, basic necessities. It's about transforming the whole nature of our life, including our consciousness. And that entails within a communist society getting rid of that division of labor. Now, I put this quote up front. This from the German ideology, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with them, sitting around talking about we could be a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, a critical critic. Now, some people say that comes from the German ideology, and some people say, well, did they really think that? Or is it joke? And it quite possibly is them discussing, speculating on what they might want to do in a future society. And that has to be borne in mind when reading Marx. A lot of his discussions aren't dry discussions. They are speculations about what society could be in a different form. That comes from the German ideology, which it strikes me, the German ideology really is a set of notes that somebody has compiled together. Marx is writing scribbled notes, etc., and called it a book, the German ideology. So basically, a lot of ideas that Marx compiled and said he would consign to the gnawing criticism of the mice. So, but at least it shows that he is speculating on all sorts of different things. I want to I'll finish up in a bit, but it's not just the early writings where Marx talks about this. If you look in the Grundrisse, again, note forms not put back together until much, much later, not available in in the United Kingdom till the 1970s, translated. Marx speculating on what a future society will look like in a very open sort of way. So he talks about the development of automation, natural science, all sorts of things. But the whole basis of that society to get rid of the division of labor and create free time for people to achieve some sort of human potentiality, that expansion. Anyway, these are just descriptions of what we are experiencing, isn't it, in terms of automation. The automation within the form of society that we've got is a threat to the livings of working people. In a communist society, a different mode of production, it could be used to reduce the necessary labor time. It could be used to get rid of the wages system. So he's saying that the realm of freedom, that notion of a whole change in the capitalist society, can only begin with that reduction in labor time. So communism has got to be dependent upon expansion of productive forces to make a different form of life available. But the development of that form of life is dependent on people wanting to change that form of society and establish a different form of society. I think I'm just coming down to basically what he's describing. Now, the other thing that strikes me very often is that people would say they don't very often discuss abolition of money, abolition of the wages system, all these things, but they describe it. If you talk to people and you say we should be getting rid of wage labor, we should be getting rid of money, it will be described that you're being totally utopian. And yet Marx was using those sort of phrases all the time. Now, so there's that one thing it being described as utopian and out of the kilter, out of the realms of consciousness. But the other thing that needs to be borne in mind is the threats that we face as a humanity, really. So it's not just about getting rid of those problems about the cost of living, about we can't afford to live, we can't afford to live, but also the existential threats that we face. And that's particularly in my view, things like war, and climate change in the moment. Can capitalist society deal with those problems? Is it possible to envisage overcoming climate change, getting rid of war within a capitalist society that's based on competing nation states, on growth of productive forces, and expanding needs, necessarily trying to create needs in people for a continual production? It's my view that that is what is utopian, that idea that capital can solve the problems of humanity, not Marx's idea of a different mode of production, an abolition of wage labor, money, nation states. That's not utopian. That is necessary. What is utopian is the continuation of capital to base those things. I think I'll end there. The other thing I'm saying, it's what Nick was saying as well. There's this notion that the difference between revolutionary socialism and reformism is basically that of violence, that revolution is based on violence. Reformism or a continuation of capitalism is based on continual, gradual change. In my view, the notion of revolutionary socialism is based on an abolition of the capitalist mode of production rather than simply violence, although violence obviously may be necessary to ensure it achieves its objectives. Okay, I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, John. First slideshow, I think a bit too much information on these slides. Comrades can go back and look at the video if they want to look up some of the quotes. It did say where they are from. It certainly was interesting to have this wide range of understanding and references, etc. Also thought it was very interesting the idea of communism as a movement. It's not just an aim. It will have to be won and re-won and re-won again. It is a continuation. It's not the end. We'll have communism and then we will all lie back and whatever, relax. We'll have time to relax and live, etc. But it is an ongoing process, and that will change massively how we live and how we love and work, etc. And that will continue. So that was very interesting. Thank you very much, John. Our last speaker from the top table, so to speak, from the panel is Luke Pickrell from the Marxist Unity Group in the US. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so I'm assuming everyone can see my screen and hear me okay. So I'm going to be taking up the question that's posed, this question of what did Marx and Engels mean by socialism? And my presentation is going to be pretty quick, and I apologize for that. I'm going to try and get through a fair amount of information. So I'm calling this broadly the socialism question. And my theme is around this idea of democracy and radical republicanism. So folks have already talked about this, but I want to kind of lay out a picture of what I'm talking about here. We can more or less lay out a scheme for how we imagine our present, here being capitalism, a class society, and our end goal being communism, a classless society, as moving through a period that I'm going to call socialism, colloquially called the dictatorship of the proletariat. And then capitalism being separated between socialism by the revolutionary event, so to speak. And in particular, I want to highlight that it's in this period that we have new political forms, new political institutions are created. So again, it's going to be this middle period here that I'm talking about. And then I also want us to pay attention to the fact that what's going on is something with the state as well. So if we can imagine our current period being one in which the state dominates society, it's a class state, capital rules. Moving then one into the period of socialism when the state gradually fades away, often referred to as proletarian rulership, proletarian rule. And then the idea being that communism is a classless society. Excuse me, well, yes, it is a classless society and then also a stateless society. So kind of keeping this little map in line, if we will, or in mind. So The way I want to talk about this is to ask a few questions that I think then lead to new questions, and then that I think point us towards certain answers. So if we ask ourselves, what is socialism? I think then that question is to ask, what is the dictatorship of the proletariat? What is that middle period? Which then I think is to ask, what is the form of the political body of mass democracy? Because that's what I'm going to argue we're talking about. The dictatorship of the proletariat being mass democracy, Marx's conception of socialism being mass democracy. So I'm going to keep kind of laying this out a little bit. The form of the worker state, that form, that is the democratic society in transition to communism, that's what's going on in the period of the worker state, could be a social republic. And I'm going to argue that out. And the essence of that social republic, the essence of the worker state, the essence of socialism is the radical deepening of democracy. Keyword being on deepening. And this is more or less the map of my presentation. I will take credit for coining this very long phrase of the socialism, or the idea that socialism is the dictatorship of the proletariat, is the social republic, is a radical deepening of democracy. That reading, that very mouthful of a reading, that comes from one, as I'll discuss, the critique of the Gotha program and the principles of communism. I'm not going to talk about the principles of communism. 2, Marx's radical republicanism. I'm going to talk about what is radical republicanism. 3, Marx's comments and observations on the Paris Commune. I'll talk about that. And then I'm going to throw in some later comments by Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Karl Kautsky to kind of flesh out the influence of this idea of mass democracy, radical democracy. So to bring in the critique of the Gotha program, I'm going to read out this quote here. What we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect economically, morally, and intellectually still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. So the reason I highlight those words is to emphasize this point of transition, which the other presenters have talked about. We're talking about socialism, this middle period, being something that is birthed in capitalism, emerges from capitalism, and takes a very long time to fully become communism. It is this period of birth and transition in which many elements remain, and that tasks us with dealing with those many elements in that period. That's what I want to emphasize, and what I get from the critique of the Gotha program. So I want to talk about then this radical republican tradition, which is where this reading of the social republic, socialism as this social republic, comes from. I don't have time to go into it enough. You can briefly say that you see it in traditions coming from the French Revolution, from the Chartists, from anti-federalists in the United States, a period of those folks. Long story short, one can kind of locate that tradition within ideas of the simpler government, the better. Society should dominate the state, and there's a profound belief that people can organize themselves, and that there's individual freedom through social emancipation. There's a belief in the popular delegacy over representative governments. There's a strong emphasis on a unicameral legislature, and there's also a strong emphasis on popular control over state organs. So this is not Marxism per se. This is something that Marx takes up. And to highlight the fact that Marx takes that up, I want to quote Gil Schaefer here, which I think is an interesting quote. Gil writes that of the 3 sources and component parts of Marxism, English political economy, German philosophy, and the French revolutionary republicanism and socialism, Marx and Engels critique and modified all 3 save for the democratic republic, retaining its principles unchanged from its origin in the French Revolution as the state form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So I want to bring in this radical republican transition into our conception of socialism and into our discussion of democracy. So I'll talk about the Paris Commune briefly. The Paris Commune was an event in 1871 that Marx witnessed and observed and brought into his idea of society and of the working class movement. What I want to emphasize, though, is that it's the form of political organization that Marx saw within the Paris Commune that was very exciting for him. And some of the things he noticed were elections by universal male direct suffrage, the fact that representatives were held to a working person's wages, they were revocable and accountable, the fact that there was a combined executive and legislative body, the idea being that one creates laws and then enacts them. It's a mobile body, it's a working body. The fact that the standing army was disbanded for a workers' militia and that the police were under the control of the commune, and that there was a balance or a desire to find balance between local decision-making and higher centralization. There was an understanding that society can't be organized purely on a federalist model where small areas are not connected, but also a desire to not have a top-down rule over society, so to speak. And the only other thing I'll say about the Paris Commune is that it only lasted 2 months, and therefore these ideas were, I think the phrase is rather tantalizing in a way. You know, here's a little taste of a potential thing. But a taste nonetheless, a taste no longer just in the realm of theory, but a taste in actuality, in a material form that the working class created themselves. And I have a few quotes now about the Paris Commune. Marx called it the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor. We have Engels here who says, from the outset, the commune was compelled to recognize that the working class, once come to power, could not manage with the old state machine, that in order not to lose again its only conquered supremacy, this working class must do away with all the old repressive machinery previously used against it and safeguard itself against its own deputies and officials by declaring them all subject to recall at any moment. So what I hope folks are thinking about is, gosh, this sounds kind of like a social republic. This sounds like it could be located within the radical Republican canon, this form of society that we're seeing. I now want to bring in a few more quotes from the Marxist leftist tradition that continue to talk about socialism and democracy. So we have Marx and Engels writing that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy. We have Karl Kautsky writing that the French Third Republic offers no ground for the emancipation of the proletariat, but only its oppression. He was critiquing the French Third Republic. It's only when the French state is transformed along the lines of the constitution of the First Republic, the First French Republic, and of the Paris Commune, that it can become the form of the Republic, that form of government needed for the working class. We have Rosa Luxemburg writing in 1917. She says, socialist democracy begins at the very moment of the seizure of power by the Socialist Party. It's the same thing as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Yes, dictatorship, but this dictatorship consists in the manner of applying democracy, not in its elimination, but in energetic, resolute attacks upon the well-entrenched rights and economic relationships of bourgeois society, without which a socialist transformation cannot be accomplished. And I want to highlight there, consists in the manner of applying democracy, not in its elimination, but it's an energetic, resolute attacks. I want to kind of highlight this idea of deepening democracy. And then I'll bring in Lenin here, who writes that the Paris Commune appears to have replaced the smashed state machine only by fuller democracy, abolition of the standing army, all officials to be elected and subject to recall, the things I talked about. But this only signifies a gigantic replacement of certain institutions by other institutions of a fundamentally different type. This is exactly a case of quantity being transformed into quality. Democracy, introduced as fully and consistently as is at all conceivable, is transformed from bourgeois into proletarian democracy, from the state into something which is no longer the state proper. So I want to highlight this idea here of a quantitative change in the amount of democracy can actually then qualitatively change society itself. There can be a quantitative change that can change the quality of society, of the state, of democracy. So let me take a look here. I've gone through it a little faster than I actually thought I would. By way of conclusion, I want to think about some lessons for the future and kind of summarize a little bit. So I want to emphasize the fact that socialism is only the beginning of a long process of transformation. The implication here being that one might not want to totally expropriate and do everything at once. History doesn't bear that out well. And that, of course, that this transformation can't remain national. This is an international project. I'll emphasize again that elements of capitalism still remain in the social republic, and that the working class, however, is now in control of the state, but it's very conscious of its final goal and what needs to be done. And then I want to highlight this part here, which is that the state fades away because it remains subordinate to society, because it is in the social republic form. This is a concern of Marx, and I think should be a concern of everyone, which is if there is going to be a state, what keeps it from rising above society, as they have a tendency to do? And I would say that's located in this idea of social republicanism. Class struggle remains, and democracy makes class interests clear so as to work them out in public. Another reason why we need democracy is that it's actually in democratic bodies that the class struggle presents itself clearly to be worked out. We're fooling ourselves if we think that repression and banning parties can kind of do away with any contradictions. The other implication being that in this period of transition, this period of socialism, people themselves are changing. People are changing, changed people are changing society, and a changed society is changing people once again. But it's mass democratic involvement in politics that trains the masses, gives them experience, allows them to take control of their lives and of their society. And that the working class is the champion of democracy before and after the revolution. So before I wrap up here, I want us to kind of think about this quote a little bit, which is someone saying that I don't think Marx ever systematically got his head around how the state, so long as it exists, can be both subordinated to the interests of the proletariat, and on the other hand, it doesn't become a dominant Leviathan state that suffocates society. My response to that is, I think he did. I think this radical Republican, social republicanism points to him actually having an idea of what the state can look like under socialism, so that socialism can be this transformative transitional period that it needs to be. And then why is this relevant for today? I've talked about how the working class is the only champion of democracy. I think that tasks us with actually winning the battle for the meaning and the content of democracy. And then, at least in the country I live in, the United States, I point to the fact that the Supreme Court, the standing army, the police, I could go on, these are all eminently undemocratic institutions, which are held, of course, under our incredibly undemocratic constitution. And that I think it is the task of the working class to question that. There are no shortcuts to power, right? We need to build the Socialist Party through patience and unity around a program. And the fact that we need to focus on structures that are most conducive to democracy. It's one thing to say we want democracy, we need democracy. Democracy is the light and air of the working class, as Kautsky says. Okay, but what structures, what political structures facilitate that democracy? And I say that then tasks us with organizing not only the future state, but organizing our parties now along social Republican lines, which would then say you need democracy instead of bureaucratic centralism. And let's see. Finally, I'll just repeat that it's the form of the workers' state, the democratic society in transition to communism, that can be a social republic, and that its essence is the radical deepening of democracy. And then I'll finally finish by just saying that I'm not so concerned about the names that we're using for things, socialism, communism, folks have talked about that, as I am about the content of these things and the content of social and political structures. And I want to put out there that it's the political content of the dictatorship of the proletariat that we're talking about. And I'd like to kind of trigger an association between Marx, socialism, communism, and democracy, and then point out that this would be a kind of democracy that we can draw from Marx's radical republicanism, and that it probably doesn't need to be said that it's a kind of democracy we certainly don't experience in any society that is currently called democratic. And these are just a brief list of some of the sources that I used. So I'll hop out of here and stop sharing my screen.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. I thought that was excellent. That was really good. I think you've pointed to perhaps the key, what do we do now, actually? We're talking about socialism because we want to get towards it, but I think your presentation presented a sort of a bridge to how we get there. And I think that made it very useful to get into the discussion, the need for democracy. We have to fight for socialism now in our own organization, but also fighting for those demands of what we think socialism will be like. A worker's representative on a worker's wage, recallability, election of all officials, etc., an extension of democracy. I think these are hugely important demands that we should pick up now in our programs for socialism. So that was, I thought that was great. John, Nick, because it's already after 8, I suggest we open up to discussion. In the preparation for this session, we discussed that we might bring the panelists in first, but I think it's okay now to bring in people from the floor, and then we can have perhaps a discussion with all the panelists. Thank you very much, all 3 speakers. That this gives a really well-rounded idea of there are differences, but I can't see there are dramatic differences between us. The first comrade to have his hand up, I should say there were over 100 people in the session again. A few people have left now, a few others might come in later. The first person that his hand up was Norman. I'm going to, all right, hold on, I have to make you all panelists. Apologies, that takes a couple of minutes. If you want to speak, please click raise hand so I can make you a panelist, and then you can be seen and heard.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear. We can hear you. We can't see you.
Right.
Norman, can you switch on your camera, Norman?
Just a minute. Just a minute. I thought it was on.
You're there. Put your hand away. And
I'm there now. Oh, fine, thanks. Sorry about that. Yes. Thanks so much, Tina, and thanks to the 3 speakers. Excellent, really excellent presentations. I've learned quite a lot from this. My questions relate to the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Presumably, Lenin tried to implement it, but failed. And so my questions are really, what mistakes did he make? What should he have done instead, or what could he have done instead? It might be said that Russia as an agrarian state wasn't developed enough industrially for a socialist revolution to succeed. And I know this is one argument that's often or sometimes put across. Well, I'm actually old enough to have known someone who was working in Baku, in the capital of Azerbaijan, at the time of the revolution. And when the Red Army marched in, there was no fighting, and the army behaved wonderfully. But Baku was a highly industrialized city in Nobel's oil field, and there was no evidence of any move towards what has been described today as a dictatorship of the proletariat there either, although possibly the grounds for it were there. But is it more true, perhaps, as John Holiday says, that Marx believes the working class has to change itself, that is, its consciousness, before it's possible to move out of capitalism to socialism? And this hadn't happened in Russia. Was that the reason why Lenin's attempts failed? And so Lenin was, in fact, trying to do the impossible. And this idea seems a very powerful one to me, and it's been in my mind to a large extent very recently. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Panelists, Luke, Nick, and John, I suggest if either of you at some stage, at any stage, want to reply to a particular point, either do this or click the hand up button and I can bring you in. Otherwise, I'll just go through the audience now. Okay, the next person, Tony, please. Tony Greenstone.
Thank you, Tina. It was very interesting, of course, listening to the discussion about the differences, if there were differences between socialism and communism. What did Marx mean by the revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat, etc. But I got a clear feeling of the unreality of it all. Here we are in the 21st century, over a century away from the only workers' revolution. And no one has asked how it is that the working class has not yet been able to form a revolutionary party or take control. It's to feel everything is abstract, or in Marx's words, all that is solid melts into air. There is no attempt to correlate this with what is happening. We have a working class that has gone backward, not forward. I mean, notwithstanding yesterday's strike action, I mean, it's nearly a century since the general strike. And the political consciousness, not just of the British working class or the American working class, but the European working class has gone backward. The dissolution of the communist parties, the disappearance in Italy, the almost disappearance in France. Yet there is no attempt to employ a historical materialist method to any of this or to understand. And then there's talk of a non-differentiated working class. Well, I have some experience. I was heavily involved in the miners' strike and also in the Troops Out movement in Ireland. And I did see a working class that was, if you're not revolutionary, at least showed signs of approaching that. One was in Armthorpe in the South Yorkshire coalfields, where the police had actually surrounded the village and attacked it. Where, you know, I mean, the state was, literally waging war. And the other was in places like Ballymurphy, where they were up against the British Army. But the British working class has been absolutely enfeebled and divided and fragmented as a result of neoliberalism. And the same, no doubt, is true in the United States, where all the old battles in Detroit around the car plants had occurred in the 1930s, where the West Virginian miners, I mean, it's now a heavily Republican state. None of this seemed to impinge on any of the speakers. I say it was the height of unreality. Yes, the working class, but the working class not in itself, but for itself. And then there needs to be an analysis of when the working class can become the gravedigger of capitalism and when it becomes its own gravedigger. Again, not a word about how the working class can be complicit in its own oppression. How in the settler states, because I know something about Israel, it's in alliance with its own ruling class. The same was true of the Protestant working class in Ulster or Northern Ireland. You know, it's as if the method of Marxism has been abandoned by those who are Marxist. And then we come to the key question. How do we change it when the world is facing an existential crisis? Because we're more likely to see a neoliberal dystopia than a socialist utopia. Again, I heard nothing on this, so thank you, Tina.
Either of the panelists want to reply to that? I mean, I think the key issue for us would be that we want to obviously organize on the basis of what we are for and not just what we're against. So it's important to get our head around what socialism is. I thought especially Luke's introduction was very clear about what we should do here and now, etc. Marxists organizing as Marxists, crucially. John wants to quickly come back on that, I think, or slowly.
Just because I agree with a lot of what Tony Greenstein said, but it leaves us with a very negative picture, doesn't it, really? Because of course we do have to ask those questions. It strikes me all the time, why are Marx's ideas and the real ideas about a different mode of production, the socialist society, a communist society, don't feature at all. If I look at Marx, then reading Capital, there is some analysis of that, which I don't think is taken up. And that is in the section on the fetishism of commodities. Tony referred to that everything is abstract, just abstract. Marx talks about that, doesn't he? He says, because we live in a society that is abstract. We're ruled by abstractions. We're ruled by money, wages, capital, all commodities, all these things rule us. Now, that doesn't give an easy answer to how you get over that. He goes on to say about that becoming part of the natural order, reification. People can't envisage a different form of society than capital. That's the dominating. Can you imagine a world without wages? Can you imagine, let alone created a world without money? You can't even begin to analyze things like that. Marx calls it the dazzling fetish, the dazzling money fetish. So he's talking about those problems then, which it seems to me have actually increased. The reification, the fetishism of commodities has actually increased. Whereas in Marxist days, it was possible to talk about the abolition of the wages system, because at the time he was talking, quite a number of people agreed with that, but also the wages system was not common. It was only just being introduced. The money system wasn't common within societies. Colonial experience was Africa couldn't get the indigenous population to work for capital because they were the wages system was foreign to them. So I agree with what it said, but what has got to be overcome is that vision of socialism, communism has somehow got to emerge, and that has got to emerge in praxis. Importance of ideas have to be envisaged. You have to envisage an alternative form of society in order to create it and work towards that. We can't ignore that particular aspect.
Anne McShane and then Steve Freeman.
Okay, thanks. So firstly, in relation to what Tony said, well, I think to be fair, like the speakers were asked to talk on socialism as opposed to everything else. Although, of course, the questions are linked, there's only so much you can say in 15 minutes. That said, I do think it's really important, and I'm presuming that at some stage it will be on the agenda for discussion, that we do discuss the Soviet Union and the impact of its implosion. Because I think obviously it is very important. Somebody put in the comments how the fact that it had, that the lessons of it was the fact that you can't have socialism in one country. And of course that's true, but the problem is that Stalin and the Soviet bureaucracy weaponized the terms communism, Marxism, socialism to promote and give credence to an enormously authoritarian society. So basically, where socialism meant democracy and freedom, in Stalin's Russia, they meant unfreedom. They meant, not having the ability to make your views known, otherwise you'd be sent to the gulag. So they turned it upside down, and it's our job to put it back on its head again. And therefore, that is why I think we have to reclaim these terms. Communism, to hold in common. Socialism, to socialize. I mean, they're quite like simple, really, in many respects. And I think one point that hasn't been made today is the necessity for consciousness as an active agent in the creation of a new society. So consciousness not meaning simply kind of being the most, how can I describe it, developed theoretician, but consciousness meaning acting on society. And that is why I think somebody else said it, that the working class does need to become conscious now, in the sense of being aware of the tasks that have to be done in society and the need to fight for democracy, because that is the way, of course, particularly in the early stages of socialism, that you will bring about change through majority rule. And just one final point I wanted to make in respect of John. You mentioned that Marx and Engels, perhaps you just said Marx, spoke about different previous forms of society, and you said primitive society, feudalism, blah, blah, blah. But I think that you have to distinguish primitive or early communism from the consequent class societies, because they were societies, early human society, as has been proven by numerous research that's been done since Engels. Of course, the work of the Radical Anthropology Society and many others have shown that even today there continue to exist societies which reflect in distorted form a very different way of organizing, a communal way of organizing. And it's not therefore some pie in the sky thing to imagine that this could happen again. It's part of what it meant to be human before this class society came about and really dehumanized us. So I think that's early communism. Again, I think that's something we should talk about at some stage. But thank you to the speakers. Okay, thank you.
Yes, just quickly on that, we are talking about it in March, I think March the 2nd, and we're also going to talk about the Soviet Union in the session afterwards. Steve Freeman.
Yeah, thanks to all the speakers, but I'm just going to say, Tina, you'll not be surprised to hear that I agree with Luke. Okay, Luke is really on the money with what he said. Now, obviously, Luke, we're British Marxists, so really British Marxists don't really do republicanism. I mean, you can take that as given. And in England, it's even worse. So in a sense, there's a kind of gap in everybody's thinking. We did have a republic in 1649, but it was defeated and it's cast a dark shadow over us ever since. But anyway, let's put that little bit aside. British Marxism has never done any kind of republicanism. But I think that what we can see here, to put it in context, and you'll understand if I call myself a Republican communist, and I think Marx was a Republican communist, by the way, we can see three trends here. We've got liberal socialism that Tina outlined at the beginning. We've got Republican communism, and we've got anarcho-communism. Now, Tina outlined liberal socialism. That's people who, and this is all to do, what differentiates these three trends is their attitude to the state. Now, the liberal socialists believe that you can utilize our liberal state by winning a majority in the Westminster Parliament, taking control of the Crown, and then using the Crown powers to introduce some socializing measures from above. We know that that's what the Corbyn movement was all about. At the opposite extreme, we have anarcho-communists, the opposite, who like all communists, by the way, all communists believe that human emancipation and freedom means ending capitalism, class rule, abolishing wage labor, abolishing money, abolishing prices and profit. Comrades have said that, and I agree with that. So all communists, anarcho-communists or Republican ones, agree with that. But the anarcho-communists believe that you can almost proceed to abolish the state straight away. Abolish the monarchy, abolish the armed forces, abolish the nation state, abolish parliament, and proceed to communism directly. Anarchism being the most extreme version of that. Whereas, pure anarchists. But Marx or Lenin understood, of course, there was a strand of anarcho-communism in what he called left-wing communism, the ones with the infantile disorder, because they didn't have that strand. Republican communists believe in the necessity of replacing the existing state, with a democratic republic, we first have to establish a democratic republic, and all the arguments, Luke, that you put forward, obviously to support that. And a democratic republic is different from a liberal republic, like you have in America or France or US, where you basically got a presidential bureaucratic system, and it is basically the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. But a genuinely democratic republic that Marx was talking about is one which is fully and consistently democratic from top to bottom. And in that sense, as you outlined, Marx was a Republican communist. And that's the thesis that Bruno, you cite Bruno Leopold, he makes in his thesis. So coming down on Luke's side, and Luke did a very good, much detailed analysis of that. The only one sort of thing that none of us have considered is where you draw the line between what can be done in one country and what has to be done internationally. And it all gets sort of lost. Is communism really a global solution to the problems? And if you can have a democratic republic in one country, in the way that you describe, Luke, you know, the democratic and social republic, if you want to call it that, a fully and consistent democratic republic in one country. How far can you go in one country? Because we have this problem that we learned from the Russian Revolution, that you can't have socialism in one country. So we need to think about the interaction between the national aspect of it and the international. And I will finish there. But just to say, Luke, I thought your presentation was on the money, on the button. I don't know what it would be, on the money probably. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That's an interesting question with the global communism. It has to be a global system, isn't it? But the working class is separated into different countries still, and revolutions will probably happen at different stages in different countries. I mean, what was interesting about the Russian Revolution is that Lenin said quite rightly, you know, without the German working class making revolution, we're finished. But he thought the German state, the German working class was so advanced at that stage, and the German state was so important in imperialism. Had that gone over to revolution, to the communists, it could have sparked other countries. So, you know, sometimes one or two at the beginning might be enough, perhaps, you know, to spark then other countries following. But today it will probably be America, Germany or something, or Britain. Would be an interesting question. Nick, did you want to come in now, or do you want to wait a little bit?
No, I'll see what a couple more people have to say, please.
Okay. Marion, please.
Yeah, I think it's been an interesting discussion tonight. But I think there's a bit of pessimism as well. I'm very optimistic because the crisis of the economy, the crisis in capital is even more right now for its overthrow. The contradictions are deeper and deeper. But what the key question is, how do we change the consciousness of the working class? And I had a surprise yesterday. I was talking to my sister, who was a Thatcherite, didn't really believe in unions and strikes. She was saying we need a general strike to change things. We all need to unite together and have a general strike to change things in this country. Now, that is a leap for her, but I thought it was interesting she was talking like that. She's never spoke like that, very rarely before. So I think we have to look at how do we change the consciousness of people. And yes, it's a long time since the general strike. It's a long time since the Russian Revolution. And we've had quite a few defeats over these years. But the key question has been the lack of a clear revolutionary leadership that has known how to intervene in different countries and internationally. And yes, on some levels, there's been a lot of setbacks in that. But I find what we're talking about now, what we're trying to do now, is a big step forward, because we're trying to come to grips for what is needed to be done in order to develop. Well, I always say we've got most of the ideas are there. We've got a lot of the solutions. The question is a lack of proper understanding and a lot about how we change people's minds. And that's, for me, is why I think it's very important that we do actually attempt to have a transitional method in what we do. How do you go about changing people's consciousness? Partly it'll come about through their experiences, and then beginning to question why things are why they're like what they are now, and how do we change them. So this is, for me, is very, very important. But equally, we need a proper leadership. But through my experiences, the key is democracy. And in most of the left groups or groupings that I've been involved in, I would say that has been one of the main problems, a lack of democracy, the people being in cliques and organising and doing things behind people's backs. No openness, no proper discussion, and no understanding of what is needed to be done. And if we organise locally as well and campaign locally, you can also begin to change people's mind. I think in a lot of the so-called red wall district, why they went the way they did was that the trade union movement and other people ignored them. They weren't involved with them. They weren't doing community campaigning. They weren't campaigning. They weren't listening. They weren't looking at what their needs were and things like that. So we hold a responsibility to organise the working class in all its forms and develop and actually try and change people's consciousness and make sure they understand what their role is. Ultimately, if we organise ourselves, we can rule ourselves and we can change things for the better.
Thank you, Marianne. Will McMahon, please.
Wow, that was a really grounding contribution from Marianne, I think. I found, and I'd like to thank the speakers, actually. Like Tony, I found it a bit abstract, really, but I can understand why it was, because people were trying to squeeze a lot into a very small amount of time. So I really get that. And I just want to pick up on what you were saying, Tina, about the thing about the Russian Revolution. It was never going to succeed unless the German Revolution succeeded. And Lenin and Trotsky knew that. They knew it, I think, and it didn't. And we've been living with the repercussions of that ever since, actually. And they were further pressed. Those repercussions came through in 1989 at a level of mass consciousness that communism was finished. So actually we are, even though we are 30 years on, we are still starting at a very low level. And we do have enormous obstacles to overcome in actually explaining what socialism is. And so we need to do some thinking about that and about how we explain what it is. And by socialism, I mean communism, etc. I'm just going to be quite prosaic, really, quite blunt, which is I can't think of an example. There's one, maybe, an example of a ruling class that has run away, that has said the game is up. The only one I can think of is in Grenada, where literally Geary got on an aeroplane and with his ruling classmates and they ran away. But in general, that ain't going to happen. And I don't think it's going to be particularly pretty. And we need to have some thoughts about what that process might look like. So if you look to what happened to the commune, you look at fascism in Europe, you looked at the military dictatorships in Latin America, you look at what's going on in China now. Also, you look at the situation where we have a kind of I think we're coming to an end of a bourgeois democratic period, really, because bourgeois democracy is under attack. Because I think Luxemburg was right when she said the bourgeoisie don't really need democracy. They don't really need it. They'll get rid of it. Then they don't really need it. And I think that's what we're beginning to see. And I think that they would revert to a kind of a necessary repression of the working class. I mean, we can just see what their response was to Corbynism. Yeah, he was a very fluffy left social democrat with some quite radical programs, but not really a threat to capital, and how they undermined and defeated him in civil society, basically. Their approach to a mobilized working class would be something different. And I think the thing that we have to contend with in terms of socialism and this dictatorship of the proletariat idea is that we face and it sounds like a really stupid thing to say, but a very modern ruling class with a very professionalized army, very professionalized governing structures, and who are, for the most part, ahead of us in thinking up until now, actually. So my thought about socialism and how we get there is that actually, in one sense, it will be a battle for democracy, because it will be a battle for democracy against the ruling class repression of the democratic freedoms that we have now. As the working class goes on an offensive, that's where we'll find ourselves. And I think that then that's where the dictatorship of the proletariat would come in. Now, dictatorship of the proletariat as a term, is quite old-fashioned, but as a scientific necessity is quite modern, yeah? And it needs to be defended and understood. So my question is that it's been quite good theory, yeah? But how do we have that discussion amongst the working class, of which I hope we all consider ourselves part, about how you confront a bourgeois state that will attack them ruthlessly? How do we have that discussion? Because we have a cognitive problem, yeah, which is we can't even imagine ourselves being there. And before we get there, we have to have that discussion about it. And I actually think, social republic, whatever, I don't actually think that really matters, to be honest with you. I don't think we'll be discussing the niceties of a social republic when we're in hand-to-hand battle with the ruling class. We'll be talking about one class defeating another, and that would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, the most democratic thing we've actually seen. So I quite like, not necessarily now, but at some point, a conversation of what we think about that.
Thank you, Will. Nick wants to come back in briefly.
Yeah, so there is a real problem that we're facing, because we've tried to organize a whole series of discussions and sessions, and we may have got the topics wrong and so on. But I would hope that over a period of time, we do grapple with the issues that have been raised. I think it's difficult. Tony and then Will have said abstract, and I think there's a certain inevitability about that in the nature of the discussion that we're trying to have, because we're trying to, in a sense, we're on ground zero. Turn what Tony, I'll say a few words about Tony's contribution in a moment, but take Tony's contribution and how we ourselves, the organizers of these events, started with our advert, if you like, or the appeal. And it's based on the idea that socialist ideas, or the understanding, the historical materialist assessment, if you like, it's based on the understanding that socialist ideas have been pushed back into a redoubt. They've been pushed back into the recesses of the dirtiest, darkest room. And so what do we do about it? Well, we can pour a cup of cold sick over those that want to discuss how to move forward, which is what Tony did, or we can engage with the difficult circumstances that we're in and try to begin to discuss a way out. How do we battle out of this corner? How do we fight back? And so just trying to pick some of the threads together, my own view in terms of why we're in this position, it goes back actually to Stalinism and the experience of Stalinism and socialism in one country, and why that theory is the most pernicious, cancerous growth in the working class movement, because it completely miseducated a whole layer of militants, generation after generation after generation. And then paradoxically, and this is a real paradox in my opinion, when it collapsed, as it inevitably must collapse because you cannot have socialism in one country, the consequence of that was that all of those people who didn't quite like it but thought that actually it showed that there was an alternative to capitalism concluded that there was no alternative to capitalism. And if you look at the international communist parties, they all collapsed, they disintegrated. And working class areas in Italy, in France, where there'd been mass communist parties, actually started voting for the far right. So there are all sorts of other reasons that we can go into, and clearly another discussion or several other discussions we have to have. That's an ongoing discussion. But the question is, what do we do about it? So it seems to me that on this discussion, we've had over 100, we've got 78 people. Presumably everybody is here because they don't like the social conditions that we are confronting. And we are socialists or communists of one form or another. And probably we're here because we're not in one of the existing groups, because we may have been, or we've had a look and we don't want to be in. So we have to do something about it. We can give up. It'd probably be a lot easier for most of us, but actually we're part of a class that's got to fight back. And so that's what's beginning. I mean, after 30 years, the strike figures in Britain are on a par with what they were in 1989. So we're at the sort of foothills again. And actually, Britain probably isn't the best place to look for a militant proletariat. It's an international phenomenon. But why these discussions, I think, are important, even if they are abstract in form to begin with, is that they remind us about what Marx and Engels were arguing for, how they argued and how they intervened in the working class movement in the 19th century, because we need to do the same. And they can help us and they can guide us from a position of isolation into having the confidence or the optimism, or perhaps I might call it the stupidity, to believe that our ideas actually can conquer the working class once again. And I do believe that, because the conditions facing working class people mean that they have to fight. And we have to assist them fighting through their misleaders, their traitors, these people that have abandoned any idea. All we have now in the labor movement, with a few honorable exceptions, is people that want to protect their own positions, and they'll trample on the working class in order to do so. And we have to find a way of challenging them, confronting them, removing them, replacing them, and getting a self-active working class. And to do that, go back to the points that were raised last week, we need a party. So coming out of these discussions, concretely, what has to be done? We have to form a putative party. We have to have a party so that we're not just discussing with 100 people once a week, but we have, small branches, big branches all over the country. We can organize interventions. We can have literature. We can have leaflets. We can have TV. We can have radio. We can begin to make a dent in this absence of consciousness about what we need to do to change society. So I've spoken longer than I ought to have done, so I apologize for that.
Yes, I was told off that we overrun last week. I fear we might be overrunning again. Apologies, comrades, but it is an interesting discussion. Minnie, please.
Hi, gosh, yes, could do the cup of tea. A bit dry here. Soy milk. So, how do we get from exploitation via expropriation through emancipation to everything gained for all of us? That's what we've been hearing as speakers about Marx. I think a lot of what we know, what we think we know, there's so many simple things that we don't understand. And I've been through this myself. And one of them is, John mentioned fetishism and commodity fetishism. Obviously, it's the production of things we don't need, and we're being, we have to have things that we don't need. We're bombarded. Everyone else has got them, whatever, SUVs, cars like tanks. We need public speaking about huge issues, and what Nick said, we need a media, we've got to abolish wage slavery. Marx called capitalism wage slavery. And as my partner Graham said the other day, is there a halfway house between abolishing slavery or not abolishing slavery? Is there a halfway house? What is this transition? So we're commodities. And people, Marion said she was surprised by what a friend said. So many people on social media now are saying things that you think, I wouldn't have imagined they'd have said something like that. Or, and it's quite something, because Chris Packham today, he put a post up saying, you know, because in the context of it being so urgent now, climate change and everything, we are being, I'm quoting him now, we are being cooked, choked and taken to the cleaners. If we ever become anyone's ancestors, they will ask, what the hell were these mugs doing? They stood by and let them burn the world. And of course, we know that the 50% of people have turned off politics. Politics has failed us all over and over and over again. There's fear, the power of the weapons. There's fear of all the crime around us. Fear that the rich are being protected and not us. Fear of stepping out and saying things. Look what has happened to Julian Assange. And this week in Germany, in January, somebody called Heinrich Bucher was criminalized. His act of speaking out against the war with Russia has been criminalized. He said, we Germans must never again be involved in a war against Russia. And he's now been criminalized, and he's either got to go to jail for 40 days or be told, yeah, I'm getting that, or be told to pay a fine of 2,000 euros. So I just think, and the psyops, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, of the proletariat, must reveal what the rich are doing, like the World Economic Forum. With COVID, they've got air filters, they're wearing masks, they've got all the windows open, they're having PCR tests. Whereas for profit, in the name of profit, the working class is sent out there to catch something that it's now becoming apparent messes with your immune system and is similar to AIDS. So the working class can go out and do that, but we're not doing it. No, we'll let you believe one thing and we'll do the other. Mick Lynch's speech, the unions calling for general election, that's a psyop. Starmer's a psyop. He's not even a party of Labour. You're kidding me. He didn't even tweet about anything about the things yesterday, the big strikes, the strikes that are going on at the moment. I'll wind up there. Okay.
Thank you, Minnie. Sergio, please.
Hi. I would like to thank all the speakers, and I have a question for Luke in the spirit of making things more concrete. I was wondering about parliament and councils, since those two forms of democracy that are usually the forms that we discuss about when we talk about some kind of transitional phase or even permanent structures of self-government of the working class. Like those are the structures that we mostly talk about, and those were, I think, absent with you. And I was wondering what your thoughts are, if you think that councils are some kind of a transitional structure that are possible, or, well, yes.
Good question. Thank you, Sergio. Anita, please.
Great, thanks very much, Tina. I mean, yeah, I agree with people about there is a level of sort of abstractness to these sort of discussions, but for me, actually, it's been it's put me on a really steep learning curve for starters, which is always exciting anyway. My own political education has always kind of been, defined against Stalinism and begun and ended at 1917 and the Russian Revolution. So this is new to me, reading Marx in its, well, I haven't been able to read it. It's actually quite difficult to read some of those texts. So having these discussions has actually been really, really good for me. I don't actually think it's that abstract in the sense that, it does contribute to how I think and intervene, in the Labour movement outside. Although I'm not going to Labour Party meetings anymore. I'm still a member, but I'm not going anymore. But if I were, I would find this discussion really useful to take to the meetings. One of the things that I think I wanted to kind of bring up with Luke's kind of presentation was one of the key things I think as Marxists we kind of are able to use, one of the tools that he gives us is an understanding of societies and states, by the mode of production. And, that's a really powerful tool in which we understand, why the state exists in the way it does and the kind of democracy it might have and not have, and why it does the things it does. And I felt that was kind of a bit lacking in your presentation. I wasn't quite sure where you were placing your idea of what socialism is. What was the mode of production that was underpinning your kind of description of socialism? If the mode of production is changed, as we would like to see it change, but the working class take control of that mode of production, then the state itself becomes a completely different entity. Where were you placing your description of the state, in that relationship? I do feel as if, it feels like if the working class is going to take charge of the mode of production, it actually probably happens really fast, That's why we call it a revolution, that we can't have sections of the bourgeoisie left untouched because, they pose real dangers to the working class. So I wondered if Luke could come back on that a little bit, on that. But on a practical level as well, Mick Lynch, for instance, when he speaks, our goal as activists in the party, and if there was ever anything coming out of this, if there was some kind of revolutionary form, our goal in terms of intervening and talking to people in struggles on picket lines or whatever, is ultimately to talk about the mode of production, isn't it, at the end of the day, to kind of raise those ideas which are leading to, why are we leaving these things in the hands of people who can't even run them? And one of the things I feel quite optimistic about is the fact that Mick Lynch is actually quite powerful in the way he raises some of these things. There's a real implication in some of the things he says. He's a very class-conscious speaker, and that's really quite refreshing and new in lots of ways for us, for a very long time. But he kind of almost makes you think, actually, and I'm sure a lot of people do think that, why doesn't he just run the railways? He kind of talks about the whole transport system in the railways as if he could run it so much better. So it's immediately kind of posed, who owns that and who runs it, kind of thing, the way he does it. It feels as if things are can happen very fast. Of course, one of the reasons I think that's happening is, the crisis is so deep, there are no answers to it. So I don't know who said that. Somebody's sister said we need a general strike. And yes, I think the crisis is so deep that people are kind of peeling away from the state, from the kind of normal sort of, things that held them together in relation to the, into the state or the bourgeoisie. So there's real kind of things opening up here in a way that I've never actually experienced for a long time. Actually, I don't even think the miners' strike would kind of say that here. So in that sense, what I think this contribution, this kind of discussion brings to me is the idea that we are in a position now, I feel in a position now, actually, socialism is actually I think Will raise this, that they're sort of interchangeable. And so right now we could sort of talk about socialism because communism is a dirty word right now. Actually, I'm beginning to think it's the opposite. I think in a sense, Corbynism and what's going on in the Labour Party, certainly in this country, socialism is actually really kind of, completely mixed up with social democracy. I've ended up being in sort of left caucus meetings with people who are nothing, have no idea what socialism is as social democrats. So I just feel actually the time has come to be openly communist and to openly talk about a whole series of things. I think there's an audience for it now, and I think this kind of discussion can actually play a really good part in contributing and changing your own consciousness about how you intervene. So thank you for doing it, and I look forward to the rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Rob is our last speakers from the floor, and then we're going to bring up the three panelists briefly to sum up. Thank you, everybody.
I'll be very brief because I'm quite conscious of the time. But yeah, I just really want to echo the comments made by Nick and John and others in the chat that the nature of this discussion was always going to be abstract, because we're looking at what is socialism. Socialism does not in the present day exist. It is an abstraction. But then, you know, the purpose of our movement is to turn that abstraction into a reality. And I think a lot of people are concerned with getting to the point of turning that abstraction into reality before defining the abstraction, which to me seems, you know, ridiculous, to be blunt. You know, we're going to have a revolution and then just what we're going to do then? You know, you need to decide. You need to lay out the terms of the new state before you enter it. You know, Marx, you know, says that the old society is impregnated with the new one. You know, we have to really define those terms. And I think to kind of say otherwise and say, oh, you're just abstracting, is to really remove the teeth of the movement. Because how do you touch class consciousness without offering them a viable alternative? Without actually saying to people, the world can be different and this is how it can be different. Because if people don't understand that, they're never going to, you know, really look at the movement in any severity or sincerity. So that would be my, you know, my real contribution to the discussion. You know, that aside, you know, I think there's been a couple of discussions about what socialism is, and I think we all agree that it's the abolition of the state in its current form. I think that's something that all the panelists would agree with, and I think a lot of the contributors would agree with. And you know, we have to then start thinking about what that looks like in a reality, and that is an abstraction. And I'm not going to apologize for it being an abstraction. I don't think anyone else should. That's my comment.
Thank you very much, Rob. Okay, comrades, sorry if there's anybody I couldn't bring in. I think there's a couple of comrades having problems with pressing the hand up button, but I can't see anybody else with their hand up now, and we're running late again, I'm afraid. I thought it was a really interesting discussion. There's clearly slight differences between the speakers, Nick and John on one hand and Luke on the other, but I don't think they are of a variety that means we can't possibly work together. The reason we've been discussing what is socialism is to understand what we're fighting for. Clearly, it is not, you know, it is a path of getting to the future, and we want to be clear what we're fighting for. There are a couple of organizations now that are calling for a new party without a program. They haven't got a program and they want to build a party. I think this is absolutely the wrong way around. If something comes out of this, a new Marxist party of some sort, which I hope it does, we will have had a lot of discussions about what program we're fighting for, what future. That's very important. I'm going to bring in the speakers now in the same order as they did at the beginning. Nick is first, then John, and then Luke.
Okay, well,
if you could keep it to 3-4 minutes each, that would be fantastic.
Put your hand up and stop me otherwise. Thank you very much to everybody for the contributions, and it's just a shame that we can't cram everything in and everybody in to deal with these points, but I really liked Rob's point there at the end, because what we need is a prepared working class. What's it preparing for? It seems to me that it's an essential part of any revolutionary struggle that you need to know the end game, the aim. What are we actually fighting for? I'm not going to comment on the sense or not of the call for a general strike at the moment, but I pose this question: a general strike, and then what? The consequence of the general strike will be potentially that the Tories fall and we'll get a Starmer-led government. So we need to think about what it is we want, where we're going, and that's why we need a party. The party is the memory of the class, the learning of the class, the educator of the class, to intervene. And I saw in one of the comments, I can't remember whether it was Tony or somebody else, said that we're sort of condescending to people because we're not allowing people to draw. We don't accept that people can draw their own consciousness or about the need for change. Well, I don't think anybody's saying that. But the problem with not having a party is that that process is slowed down, completely slowed down. There's no method by which we can impart the lessons of the past fast, quickly, and directly to people to assist in their consciousness being raised. I can remember two seminal conversations that I had when I was a teenager, or perhaps a little bit older, that helped me to become a conscious Marxist. Somebody helped me get there, and we need to help others to get there. And if we became Marxists, revolutionaries, socialists, whatever you want to call us, then that means that everybody can. We're not unique, we're not special, we're not different. We need to find the form and the strength to try and make others like us. Thank you.
Short and snappy. Thank you very much. John, please.
Yeah, I'll try to be as brief as snappy, but I don't think I'll achieve it, but I'll try and be brief anyway. But I'm not sure at all about the party. The way Marx talks about the party is quite different at different times, isn't it? And he talks about the class being formed into a party. It's about class and class consciousness, that revolutionary potential for overcoming the present society. I agree with the points that Rob was making and the earlier points that Nick made about you don't get anywhere unless you have a vision of the end. You have got to talk about communism, socialism, whatever that means. I find it useful to go back to Marx and Engels when they're talking about the nature of that society. And it is sporadic throughout their writings, but fundamentally it involves a change in the mode of production, a fundamental change, abolition of the social relations of capital, wage labor, money, capital, etc. You don't get anywhere unless you start to agree with that. Having said that, I wouldn't be entirely negative. Just on the demonstration yesterday and on the picket lines and what you see on the media, etc. There are two aspects to it, aren't there? The workers interviewed, they always say how they don't want to be on strike, how they're desperate to get back to work. And that is a reflection of a reality, isn't it? That they do enjoy some of the jobs they do, but also the social contact and the social contact with people. On picket lines, you see the same thing. People saying they don't want this strike, they want to get. On the other hand, what you can see is an absolute act of solidarity and enthusiasm that they are actually challenging the system. And it's that we need to build on. But you won't build on that, in my opinion, without coming out with some fundamental requirements about what the nature of the change is, an alternative to the capitalist society. You don't get anywhere without raising that. It's called class consciousness, and we can't get anywhere without that class consciousness, and it cannot be ignored. You cannot have a change in society without a socialist, class conscious working class. So that's where I'll end up, but we need to discuss what that means and how we achieve it.
Thank you very much, John. Luke, you're summing up, please.
Sure. I'll sum up by answering the best I can to some of the questions that were asked, especially the ones towards me. The first one, this question of what mistakes did Lenin make in Russia? My thought with that is just that the problem is when we hold something kind of static as a model, which I think happens a lot. So when we hold 1917 as a model to be repeated, when we create something called Leninism or the Leninist party, and when that gets held as something static. I think when we're lost, we should question the things that we make assumptions about. I think, well, that question made me think about that. Regarding councils and parliament, I'll touch on councils only because when I was much more new to this, a very influential book that I read was Colin Barker's Revolutionary Rehearsals in the American version of the International Socialist Organization. And that book essentially, I think, kind of trains one to look at previous revolutionary situations in history and locate the council, essentially. Look at the history and find where the council developed. So when I read, for example, Mike McNair's revolutionary strategies, and he said, well, councils won't work, I felt like a carpet had been kind of pulled out from underneath my feet. But I think that's the question. Do councils work? Can they organize society at the level that it would need to be? Can they kind of penetrate society at the level that the state would be? I'm not saying that they're incompatible, and I just find it funny that, all of these countries were named so-and-so Soviet Republic, Union of the Socialist Soviet Republic. So there's some, at least, precedent for them being combined in some way. But the question being, are they a standing body? Do they meet regularly? X, Y, and Z. In regards to the mode of production during socialism, I do think that capitalism remains to a great deal. I think the difference, though, is that there is the state that is now being consciously used to kind of bring out the socialist elements that already exist within capitalist society. And so we now have kind of all of the resources and essentially kind of a plan directed at taking society in a particular direction. And then just regards to kind of what is to be done, what do we, how might we talk to someone about this or bring this into a discussion? At least in the States, well, I'll back up a sec. One can always point out, I think, as said, that to whatever extent democracy, and I'll put it in air quotes, is given to us now, it will always be taken back. And so the idea that one can make alliances with liberal parties in the defense of democracy is a mistake. That's something that comes up a lot here in the United States, where the two parties play off against one another and say, support us so that you don't get them, we'll defend your democratic rights, and then it just switches every 4 years or something. But the idea being that you can point that out, you can point out the undemocratic nature of the existing state, and the fact that that remains despite what parties in power. And then I'll just come to the end here by saying, I think that's what made, at least to me, this kind of recent Supreme Court decision in the United States around abortion rights kind of interesting, which is that folks kind of went like, huh, how can a court, review another court's decision and change it? And then that brought in a discussion of the Constitution. And what is this thing that hovers over us regardless of who's in power? So, maybe some talking points at least. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. We're almost on time. I think we've covered the issue from various aspects. John puts a lot of emphasis on the mode of production as socialism. I think Luke emphasized as well the extension of democracy, and that is important as well to get the ruling class, the working class into charge of the mode of production, etc. So there are two processes going on. I'm sure this issue will come up again in future, and I found it a very interesting discussion that was perhaps a little abstract, but as comrades have said, unless we are clear what we are fighting for, it will be very difficult to organize any kind of organization, or even intervene in the class struggle if you don't know if you're not clear about what you're fighting for. Next week, comrades, we're going to have a look at the Communist Manifesto. Is it still relevant? What are the key lessons we can learn from that? The speakers will be Rob Gold from the Socialist Theory Study Group and Jack Conrad from the CBGB Weekly Worker. He will be talking about green socialism as an example of a current version of socialism that perhaps isn't necessarily socialism, the opposite of socialism. One might even ask, so there's little controversial theses put out there. Hope you come back next week, and we'll see you soon. Good night, comrades.